afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Building Healthy, Strong Communities Session 2, Get Out the Vote, a Social Work Call to Action. Before we begin, I want to go over a few housekeeping notes. If you wish to receive CEs for today's webinar, you will need to stay for the duration of the event and respond to all the poll questions you see pop up throughout the presentation. You will see the first poll now. If you do not see the poll pop up, please place your response to the question in the chat. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the event, so please submit any questions you have in the Q&A box or in the chat. We encourage participation in the chat throughout today's presentation. You can also drop questions in there throughout, and we will ask them during the presentation. I am now going to turn it over to Sabrina Clark, the president of the School of Social Work's Alumni Board, to introduce today's presenter.
Thank you, Madison. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce Justin Hodge. Hodge is a clinical assistant professor of social work, the co-lead for the Policy and Political Social Work Pathway, and the director of the online certificate in political social work at the University of Michigan. He is committed to increasing the presence of social workers in policy and political spaces. He teaches courses that provide students with the tools to engage in politics and approach policy work from a social justice perspective. Hodge was elected to the Washtenaw County Board of Commissioners in November 2020. He has a particular focus on addressing inequities in Washtenaw County and promoting economic opportunity. In 2021, Hodge was appointed by Governor Whitmer to the Commission on Community Action and Economic Opportunity, where he is able to lend his expertise at the state level. Nationally, Hodge serves as board president of the Congressional Research Institute for Social Work and Policy, which works to expand the participation of social workers in the federal legislative and policy processes. He is also a founding board member of the Social Work Democracy Project, a charitable organization focused on providing resources to schools of social work to advance knowledge of government and democracy. He feels strongly that all social workers should be involved in our democracy and works individually with students to help them find how their desired career can align with that. Justin, we thank you for presenting for us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. When you all reached out and said this was a topic that was of interest and asked if I knew anybody that'd be interested in presenting, I thought, well, what about me? I usually present here. So I'm glad you all said yes, and I'm really excited to be here. For everybody that's attending, I would love to take questions as we go throughout the presentation. Typically in class, I don't like to lecture for long periods of time without some sort of engagement. So feel free to type questions in the chat as we go. We've got a number of slides that we'll go through. Also, because of CE purposes, we have to have some questions that'll go. So you gotta stay on your toes and wait for those true and false questions to pop up. And then we'll talk about them as we go. So I'm gonna get the screen share going, and then we'll get the party started here. Okay, there we go. Okay, so as with most CE events, we have to have a set of objectives that we're going to achieve here. So these are the ones that we're going to look at today. So we're going to have a conversation about the ethical obligation that social workers have to engage in social and political action. We're going to talk about ways for social workers to be advocates for voting rights, and then to explore strategies for mobilizing and engaging voters, including people that are served by us as social workers. We're going to start off by having a conversation about ethics, because we never talk enough about ethics. So one of the things that makes our profession really unique, and something that I think is often missed by students when they're going through this, but all of you are alums, so you probably experienced this, is that we're a profession grounded in ethics, and that's not true for many of the other professions out there. Different countries have different social work codes of ethics. We're going to spend a little bit of time here talking about NASW's code of ethics and one other one after that. But there are a number of different codes of ethics across different countries where social work is practiced. But across multiple codes of ethics, these are the three items that are pretty common between them. So empowering individuals and communities, advocating for social justice, and promoting democratic participation. We're going to talk a bit here about changes to the Social Work Code of Ethics by the NASW in 2017. There have been other changes since then and before then, but the ones in 2017 really reaffirmed the profession's commitment to influencing policy and social change, and something that I think particularly social workers that are engaged in interpersonal practice work need to be more engaged with. And it's our first question time. So true or false, only macro social workers have an ethical obligation to engage in social and political action. Let's see what people have to say this one. Okay, polls are coming in. It's a good poll. Got those answers in. All right, that's pretty good. All right, the vast majority of you said false, which is the correct answer. So thank you very much. We'll close that out. So why is that true? So let's go on forward with it. So because our profession focuses on the impact of the environment and other macro forces like policy and how that impacts people's lives, really all social workers, including those that are engaged in interpersonal practice work, share this ethical obligation. So not just those that are focused specifically on policy or those that are focused on community organizing or all the other macro fields out there. It's something that all of us are supposed to be focused on. And that's something that is really critical that we all know because the majority of social workers are engaged in interpersonal practice. I know that within our school, about 80% of every incoming cohort are students that want to focus on interpersonal practice work. So getting them involved and making sure that they know that there's a space and a role for them to engage in this kind of policy work and policy advocacy is really critical if we're going to try to move any of our priorities forward. So the Code of Ethics really tries to make it clear that advocacy, social and political action, policy development, implementation are as important to the work that the field does as our commitment to social justice and social change, as well as direct practice. So we ought to do a little bit more work to make sure people know that. Code of Ethics really explicitly says that we have an ethical obligation to engage in policy and social and political action. What that looks like can differ depending on the person. We'll talk more about that later in the presentation, but just to be really clear, it's something that's something for all of us to be doing, and it's defined as our ethical responsibility to the broader society. If you're going through the Code of Ethics and looking at the different sections, it's in that one. Now I'm going to go through any questions yet so far. There are some questions. Oh, the poll was too fast. Oh, Abigail. We'll leave the poll up longer next time. Sorry, I'm just looking at the chat real quick. Okay. We'll put the chat on the other screen. All right, so now we're going to go through the Code of Ethics here and look at specific sections here that talk about what relates to policy work here. So social workers should be engaging in work that increases access to resources, employment, services, opportunities. So not just for the kinds of things that you might think about as direct practice or case management or work to connect people to resources. We should be doing it to make sure that people all have equal access to that. And that largely happens through policy. This is one that I think is particularly interesting and I think is often lost in schools of social work, because most schools of social work, ours excluded, because we have a great track of policy and political social work track that focuses on politics as well as policy. But I think most schools of social work tend not to focus on what happens in the political arena. But we do have an ethical obligation to know how what happens politically will impact our practice and the need to then engage around trying to have policy change that will improve social conditions for people that we serve and to advance our profession. So that's, if you think about the one that I always try to convince IP-focused students why they should care about this is if you are a social worker in private practice and you take insurance, you probably want to have higher reimbursement rates for insurance. The American Psychological Association has been really good at making sure that psychologists have really strong reimbursement rates. NASW is engaged in advocacy around that too. So we really activated those that large contingent of our social workers out there that are doing private practice or other forms of interpersonal practice to do advocacy like that. We have more successes there. Here are a couple more here. So we should be acting to expand choice and opportunity for all people with a specific focus on those that are vulnerable or disadvantaged or oppressed or exploited people and groups. And we should be working to increase cultural and social diversity and respect for cultural and social diversity, not just in the United States, but globally. And in a little bit, we're going to talk about one of the international codes of ethics out there too. And it gets really explicit here. So this language that I'm showing you is directly from our Code of Ethics. And it really explicitly says right here that we should be working to promote policies and practices that demonstrate respect for people and supporting expansion of cultural knowledge and resources, advocating for programs and institutions that demonstrate cultural competence, and making sure that we're doing things to safeguard people's rights and protecting and promoting equity and social justice for all people. So really, if you think about this and these really requirements of all of us, it is in some ways prescriptive in the kinds of policies that we should be engaged in advocating for. And for the social workers out there that decide to run for office and become policymakers, these are the kinds of things people should be engaged in. And then just if there was no clarity here, these are the things that we don't like. We want to eliminate the domination and exploitation of a wide range of groups across all identities. And there's a long list there that you can all take a look at. So all of this, I feel like, is very prescriptive within our code of ethics and what our responsibilities are. Okay, now we're going to turn to a bit of a conversation here around the International Federation of Social Workers. So this is a global social work organization, and it's less prescriptive than NASW because it aims at a wider, more global audience. But this looks at promoting social justice and human rights, social development, and international collaboration. If you're not familiar with the organization, if anybody's familiar with it or has heard of it, post in the chat, because I'm always curious about this one. Chat there. Give a minute, give the chat. You remember? Oh, wow. Oh, okay. You have heard of it. Good. Okay. Very nice. All right. Well, so instead of having the specific ethical guidelines that we looked at related to NASW, they focus more on general principles for ethical social work practice, and they centered around what is the mission of the organization or of the field of social work. So promoting social change and solving problems in human relationships, and then empowering and liberating people to enhance well-being. So that's what IFSW would say that the mission of our field is. They also talk about us having a role and an obligation to challenge unjust policies and practices. And they define this as our obligation to promote social justice more broadly. Okay. I would be interested by the person that says that they're a member. What is that? Okay, this person's about to join. Like, what are the benefits of membership there? I think most people are familiar with the NASW, the benefits to being a member of NASW, but maybe not as familiar with that one. If you have time, post in the chat. All right. Enough of the ethics stuff. It's interesting, but let's move on to what you all, I think, wanted to have this presentation for. What does the acronym stand for again? It's the International Federation of Social Workers. Good question. There we go. Thumbs up. All right. Okay. So turning now to what you all wanted to really talk about around voting. So there's a fantastic organization called Voting is Social Work. We've done some partnerships with them here at the U of M School of Social Work, and they really work across the country with School of Social Work across the country, and other organizations like Nonprofit Vote, which some of the information that I'm going to share with you later comes from there as well. So we have a rich history within the field of social work and working to support communities and getting registered to vote and being more engaged. Really, voting is so critical to social work. That's why the phrase voting is social work came about, because of the impact that voting has on communities. So we know that communities that are more likely to vote are healthier communities. We see increased civic engagement, and community well-being from communities that have higher voter turnout. And largely, we see that because communities that are more likely to vote are more likely to be able to engage with their elected officials. And that leads their elected officials to pay more attention to those communities, which leads to policies and programming that better benefit those communities. But there are a bunch of other benefits as well. The increased civic engagement, what we see with that is, in addition to engaging directly with elected officials, we see people that are engaged more with government more broadly, and their neighbors and civic organizations and nonprofits. So it's not just the direct act of voting, it's how voting impacts people and their engagement with other people in the world around. There's plenty of research that shows this, that there are significant health and economic outcomes that are much higher for communities that have higher voter turnout. So it's not just in our own best interest to get people to vote because we want more people voting, but also if we're working with, if you're a social worker and you're on the ground working with communities that have been historically disenfranchised, you want to engage with them because we know that getting people registered to vote and then engaged in voting will lead to better health outcomes and economic outcomes. Any questions about any of that in the chat? Nothing yet. Okay. A little bit of history here that many of you might be familiar with, but Francis Piven and Richard Cloward, they are social workers and they worked to found the Human Serve organization back in the 1980s. Their main goal with that organization was to register voters through the NASW and through schools of social work. But in addition to that, they did some work with the Clinton administration to get the motor voter law signed. So that's been really significant in Michigan. Essentially what that means is when you go to get your driver's license or to update your driver's license, typically people will then ask you if you want to register to vote. There have been some changes with that have made it even easier in Michigan, which will come up later in the presentation. But this is one of the areas where social workers had a significant impact in a federal sense on increasing access to voting. So big stuff here. But what's really nice here is this piece about how they were involved in NASW and School of Social Work to get more voters registered. I believe the number that they hit about 7 million additional registered voters through their work through Schools of Social Work at NASW. Good question. There's a question in the chat. Why isn't voting in social work more widely known? This is the first time I saw this. Spread the word. Yeah, they have a great newsletter that you can share. I think that maybe it's not as well known is because a lot of the work that they're doing is volunteer based and it's decentralized. So it's really word of mouth and trying to get more schools of social work to be aware of their work. They have a lot of different resources too. Since we're asking about voting in social work, I just want to put a plug for the resources on their website. They have a lot of really good information for how to incorporate some of this into classes. So if you teach a class that it would be relevant, or even if it's one where you think there's some way you can tie the connection to voting, they have resources for instructors. They have a lot of resources for students, and they have a ton of resources for field placements. Between them, there's another organization called Vote ER. Vote ER started off as an organization that was focused on trying to get people that work in hospital systems to be able to assist their patients in registering to vote. There's been some partnership between Vote ER and Voting and Social Work, and Vote ER has been specifically trying to target more social workers to engage with too. So they have a ton of resources to try to get field sites to become hubs for voter registration and provide tools for you to be able to do that. So I'd say check it out. It's all free, so you can go on there and get access to it. They also have Vote ER has a nice lanyard that you can get. They started off as hospital focused, so it has a QR code that you can order from them, and then anybody can scan the QR code and go through a voter register, help people register to vote that way. We've done some really cool stuff with them at U of M School of Social Work here. Sorry, Janice, that your internet is spotty today. Yep. So we've done some really cool partnerships with them and doing competitions between schools of social work to see who could get the most students registered to vote. So I would say check out both Vote ER and Voting. All right. Any other questions in the chat? All right. Nope. Okay, so in talking about voter engagement, a lot of what we're talking about in nonpartisan voter engagement is registration, education, and outreach. So anybody, at least in Michigan, you can help other people register to vote, even if you're not registered yourself. So if let's say you're a kid and you're not old enough to register to vote, but you still want to run a voter registration drive, you are able to do that. Voter education can look a lot of different ways. It could be about educating voters on issues or also candidates. There are ways to do that in a nonpartisan fashion. And then voter outreach is engaging people and trying to make sure they get out to vote. So there are a lot of ways you can do that in a nonpartisan fashion and as well as a partisan fashion. I'm going to talk to you today about ways to engage in nonpartisan voter engagement. Happy to talk about partisan voter engagement because I'm doing a lot of that this year since I'm running for re-election. So, but that's not what we're talking about today. Let's see. So, got it. Good. All right. Thank you. Any questions about any of this yet? Nope. Okay. So why don't people vote? I mean, I think that's a big question that we all have always tried to contend with and try to figure out ways around. Here's a list of some things here, and I'll talk about those. But as I talk about these, I'd love for people to put into the chat other reasons why they think people tend not to vote. So a common one that I often hear is that they think their vote won't count. And that one is, I think, particularly frustrating because I know several people that have run for office and have won or lost with less than a 5 vote difference. One person even won by 1 vote that I know. And you can think about, what the different impact that has when that maybe that person would have lost and things would have looked a lot different if that person would have lost. That one would have looked a lot different. So I think people tend to think that their vote doesn't count because they're looking specifically at federal elections. Yeah, there you go. I'll address these that are coming in the chat in a minute, but I think people tend to focus specifically on federal elections and they think about, the electoral college and all these other things, and how my vote doesn't really count. Yeah, I'm not going to argue too much with you about the electoral college, and we can talk about that if questions come up. But you got to also pay attention to what's going on at your local level of government, county government, state government, all the way up, and school board and library board. Like there are a lot of different. Another presentation that I've given for this conference before is around the various elected offices that are out there that people don't think about. Like in most places, the library board is an elected office, and better believe every vote counts there. And I think that's really critical too, as we see across the nation right now, book bannings and libraries shutting down and all of that terrible stuff. When we really want to make sure that we have good people running libraries so that they can stay open. So your vote does count, and in many ways it counts more when you're thinking about the impact that people like me as a county elected official or people that are at local levels of government, making sure that you elect the right people there. Not just because those people tend to continue to stay in politics and then possibly end up as at the state level or federal level, but because the work they're doing at local level of government is really the level of government that touches you the most on a day-to-day basis. I'd say that if you think back to the height of the pandemic and when we were just getting vaccines or vaccines were just becoming available, it was our county government that was on the forefront of getting vaccines directly to people, both setting up mass vaccination clinics and doing pop-up clinics to really try to target communities that were less likely to try to get the vaccine. So that's just one reason, or many reasons there, why you got to pay more attention to what's going on at the local level. Like that's the stuff that touches you on a day-to-day basis. If you're watching your news media choice and you see Congress continuing to do nothing about a lot of different things, that's discouraging. But if you tune into my board of commissioner meetings on the first and third Wednesdays of the month, which is peak TV, we're doing a lot there. I'm gonna look at some of the stuff going on in the chat. The internet, yeah. Oh yeah, Texas. That's a rough one there. We'll talk about Texas there. Yeah. Comments here around discouraged by the antics, apathy. Yeah, local elections do affect district and library boards are critical to democracy. Yeah, they are. School boards are also critical. Comment about anxiety and mental health concerns, lack opportunity to truly understand the candidates and topics being voted on. Yeah, that's where some of the voter education stuff that we're talking about comes into play. Okay, that's a good question. There's a question. Younger generations are telling me that they don't like anyone, so they don't care about voting. How can I respond to their complaints? Yeah, let's make sure we address that one. Only vote for presidential and not local or state elections. Local level politics so important. People don't realize misinformation and anger, intimidation on social media. All right, let's address these when we get closer to the end of the presentation. Let's see, who can keep track of that for me? Madison, you can keep track of some of these, and you and I can have a conversation toward the end about these. Yep.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep. Do it. Okay, we're gonna do that. Thank you. Keep on putting the stuff in the chat here because I think this could lead to a really rich conversation. I'm gesturing at the computer, but you can't see that. All right, too busy. So that's a very real challenge, particularly in a lot of southern states where they don't have as much access to early voting lines. We've seen a lot of efforts for voter suppression, and lines are a great way of doing that. I think it was Florida where they banned the ability for people to give water to people waiting in line to vote, just as a way to make it even worse. The candidates in politics, that's come up in the chat over there too. Georgia, yeah. You might not like the candidate, and that can be a challenge. Sometimes I think people frequently think they're picking between the lesser of two evils, which I take a lot of issue with that, and we could talk about that as well. Madison's been taking notes. Transportation can definitely be a barrier, especially in states where absentee voting is not a thing, and transportation is less of an issue in Michigan because of something that's changed recently that I'll talk about when we get a little further into the presentation. Apathy is, that's one. A lot of people just don't care, or they think it doesn't matter, which, you're giving up a lot of your power if you just choose to disengage, but I can understand why a lot of people feel apathetic about it. And then registration requirements, which registration requirements are in some ways another form of voter suppression. Okay. Yep, we're going to come back and talk about all these things in the chat. We're going to keep it going. All right, nonprofits and voter engagement. So that's one that I think is always helpful for social workers to do some engagement around, because a lot of social workers end up working for nonprofits or government agencies where there are some similar rules around this. So there's this piece right here around nonprofits can't support or oppose a candidate for public office or a political party. Are people familiar with this? And so nonprofits can't make an endorsement, they can't donate money or resources, they can't rate or rank candidates on their positions. So typically, people see this and think, oh, nonprofits can't really do much at all, which leads to the next question. So we're on question 2 here. True or false, nonprofit organizations may engage in voter registration. Curious what you think about this one. We're gonna leave the poll up a little longer this time. Going a little longer here. 2 more people didn't pick. Nonprofit organizations may engage in voter registration. True or false? The last 4 people are really thinking about it. Okay, well, we'll stop it there. Most people said true, and the answer is true. So let's talk about that. Okay. So it is true. And there are, surprisingly, I think for many people, a lot more things beyond voter registration that nonprofits can engage in. So I hear this frequently from students when they talk about their field placement, and their field placement has told them you're not going to be able to do voter registration, or you shouldn't be engaging clients around trying to do voter registration, which not accurate. So there's nonprofits are able to engage in some percentage of what is defined as political activity, and voter registration is not that. So voter registration doesn't even count towards the amount of political activity that a nonprofit can engage in. I think a lot of the fear is around nonprofits losing their nonprofit status, and they just don't want to do anything that could potentially put them at risk. Yes, League of Women Voters does a fantastic job at informing the public. But I think we have to try to move our nonprofits away from having this fear around losing their nonprofit status, which keeps them from being more civically engaged. I think about this often in the context of our field placements, because there are a lot of nonprofits that our students are at, which would be a great opportunity to get more social workers or social work students and the people that they serve through a voter registration process, or doing drives, or just making it more normal for people to engage in that. So here are the things that are really clear things that nonprofits can do that don't count as political activity. So you can do voter registration, you can do voter education, you do get out the vote kinds of activities. So that's going and making, trying to get people to go, make sure they go and actually vote. You do this closer to the election, and then they can even engage with candidates. So we'll give you some examples here about this. Voter registration. Sorry, I'm trying to also monitor the chat. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, churches are one of the largest nonprofit categories, and they tend to be very politically engaged. That is very true. So voter registration, I had this dream that we would have nonprofits all include voter registration as just a normal part of the intake process, or whatever they do when they start working with a new person. It would really normalize it, and it could be something as simple as, would you like any assistance registering to vote? And just having that be a normal part of it. There's no reason why we wouldn't be able to do that. And it's something that field placements could do. And it would also give students more of an opportunity to engage in that way. Voter education. So let's say you're working for a nonprofit that focuses on trying to improve educational attainment for K-12 students in a specific area. You can, that nonprofit, there's nothing wrong with them informing people about, hey, there are these bills making their way through the state legislature that would have X impact on the work that we're doing, or the work on education. That's a totally fine activity, but it's not one that many nonprofits are engaged in, as long as it's education focused. And then working to get people out to vote, there's nothing wrong with encouraging people to vote. The issue becomes if nonprofits start doing things that are partisan in nature, like saying, hey, go vote for this person, right? That's a thing that nonprofits can't do. What they can do is say, hey, go vote, and they can leave it there. And then candidate engagement, nonprofits can host candidate forums. So, I mean, you can think of those as like debates or when you get a bunch of candidates together to answer questions. So if we use that example that I gave earlier around education related to education, or like an education focused nonprofit that is issue focused, they could do a candidate forum where they want to ask all the candidates for, let's say, a school board, for example, their position on whatever topics are important. They just can't say we support this particular person or use it to elevate a particular person. As long as it's for informational purposes only and it's nonpartisan, that's a totally fine thing for a nonprofit to do. And there's a question in the chat. Can nonprofits contribute money towards candidates' issues? Nonprofits can't give money to candidates, so that's one of those partisan activities that they can't do. So that's one of the clear, no, can't do that. Did I answer, let me know if that answered the question or if you're asking something else. Okay, we might keep it going. And then we're going to address all those other questions that came up in the chat earlier too. Hosting voter registration events. So this is one that all of you could be, if you're thinking about in this big election year, something that you could do. One of the things you could do is to host a voter registration drive. I mean, it could be as simple as you getting together with some friends or your neighbors and going door to door in your neighborhood and asking people to register to vote and helping them register. Or you could do something more elaborate. We're going to be doing a lot of voter registration activities at the School of Social Work here, really trying to engage students with getting out into the larger community to get people registered to vote, and of course, trying to register students on the campus community. Voter registration at farmers markets. Good idea. Good one. And let's see. Embed voter registration into operations. So like I talked about before, it'd be really nice if nonprofits or field placements or government agencies or whoever else embedded doing voter registration as a normal thing into their operations. That's an easy one. But for those of you that are on the call that run an organization or are involved in operating an organization, that could be something that you advocate for to be included as part of what your operations is, just making voter registration a normal part of that. Doing tables at special events. So the person in the chat that mentioned the farmers markets, you could be at a farmers market and have a table, and you could, work to register people to vote there, and try to do it in a way that's really visible. So that's the other piece there. Make people aware. People tend not to think about there's an election coming. I mean, I would wonder if anybody even knows there's a special election today in the city of Ypsilanti, as an example, right? Like if people tend not to know a lot of these things until it's really close to happening. But that's, there's a special election today in the city of Ypsilanti that many people don't know about. Good. All right. Any questions about any of this? Keep it going here, then. All right, so to go back to some more about the voter education piece, to here, and I can share an example or a story time for me on some of this. So education on the process of voting. So if you're going to be registering people to vote, it's probably also useful to help do some education around when it happens, like the date of the election, how do you go about doing it, and you're going to get a lot of information from me soon. The next slides actually about what that looks like in Michigan. For those of you not in Michigan, I'll help you find where that information is if you're interested. I'll give you some Michigan specific information. So it's helpful to know that information, not just for yourself, but so you can pass it on to others. And then education on candidates and offices. So passing out nonpartisan voter guides or a sample ballot. The League of Women Voters, as mentioned earlier, is a fantastic resource for that. And they operate across the country. I'd say in Michigan, they are, I know them to be particularly effective. They do candidate forums, and they also do voter guides. So what that looks like is candidates all receive like a packet that they want them to fill out, asking them to answer a bunch of questions, and then they put that information on their website. So I would say go to the League of Women Voters website, and then you can put in your address, and then they'll show you a sample ballot. And if they've already done candidate questionnaires and put that out there, you'll be able to see that, so you can compare people side by side on how they feel about certain issues. they're able to do that as a nonprofit organization because they're not endorsing anybody. They're not contributing to any candidate. They're not doing it to support a particular candidate. They're really just doing it as largely a public service to get the information out there to people. And then thankfully in Michigan, typically MLive will publish the responses from League of Women Voters to get that information out there. Let's see. There's a question, do you need a representative from the county clerk or the city to officially register people to vote? In Michigan, you don't, but that differs or can differ pretty dramatically depending on the state that you're in. I know in Texas, for example, you have to go through a pretty arduous process to be able to register people to vote. And if you don't, there could be fines or penalties. So that's a question that really differs depending on where you are in the country. But in Michigan, you do not need to do that. Let's see. There's a question. What about agencies and organizations who have endorsed a candidate on their website? For instance, I've seen candidate websites have a little sticker or a badge on their website that they may have been endorsed by Planned Parenthood, for instance. Are you looking at my website? Because I'm endorsed by Planned Parenthood. Yeah, so the many nonprofit organizations have the 501c3 that we talked about earlier, and then many have a 501c4, and they use the 501c4 for political activities. So what will end up happening is that the 501c4 will do the endorsement, and it has like a different name. So it's technically a separate organization. Like there's the C3 and the C4. But you, like the average person looking at it, isn't going to know because they name it something similar. So for the person that brought up the issue there around Planned Parenthood, there's the Planned Parenthood is the 501c3, but then the C4 is usually called something like Planned Parenthood Advocates of Michigan or whatever your state is. The average person isn't going to know the difference, and they don't really want you to know the difference. But you can see the fine print if you're on the website and you're trying to make a donation. Because as many people will know, that if you make a donation to a 501c3, that's tax deductible. It's not tax deductible if you do it to the 501c4. So when you are on that page, you're really donating to what is kind of a different organization. And they make that clear on their website. Thank you, Abigail, for the link to NASW. NASW has that as well. So they have their political action for candidate election PACE. So they make endorsements, and they will frequently make financial contributions to candidates that are endorsed too. Hannah, did that answer your question? Nice. Thank you. Or you're welcome. Good. All right. Let's see. Oh, okay. I want to hit on this one around voter education. Hitting on voter education again around issues that are really important. So when I first started I started my social work career as a interpersonal practice social worker. I used to work for a community mental health system. I was doing child and family therapy for a while. I did case management for kids and adults with developmental disabilities. Eventually moved on to doing mostly crisis intervention work with suicidal teens. And working for a community mental health system is working for a government agency. And I was working there during the time when there was significant budget cuts made to the CMH system during the previous governor's administration. And that had a significant impact on who we could serve. The CMH I worked at largely became a Medicaid serving only agency. So there were a lot of clients that a lot of us had to just discharge, many of them without a really clear transition plan, which is hard for people that are doing the kind of work that, you do it because you really care about the work and you care about the people. But really what that did is with this investment by the state in the CMH system, it put operations by the people that run CMH. So in the case that I was in, I served at Tri-County Community Mental Health, which their board of directors was made up of county commissioners from 3 different counties, and then some other elected officials, and then consumers of services. It really put them in a position where they had to be very thoughtful about every decision that they made about what services we could keep or which ones we could try to expand on. So something I would start to do after I started to become more engaged in this kind of work is make the clients that I was serving aware of, hey, there's a CMH board meeting, topics X, Y, and Z are going to be discussed, and they are topics that do impact your services. If you want to make a comment about that, I would recommend that you go to the meeting. And I would start doing that a lot, and it was not me saying, hey, you should go to this meeting and say X. That would have been a problem. But me making people aware that this group of people are going to make decisions about the services that you're receiving, and this is how you can engage with them. Maybe do that. that is a totally appropriate thing to do and something that many of you are likely in the position to be able to also do. Okay, keep going. All right. Getting out the vote. So this is last phase right before an election, doing work to make sure people go and vote. So creating visibility around the election is something that any agency can do. Thinking about nonprofits, for example, they can talk about it's almost an election, almost election day. Make sure you go and vote. Similarly, they can promote early voting, and that's something that we can do in Michigan much better than we've been able to do before because of some changes in voting rights laws that are going to come up. And I think maybe like 3 more slides. And promote election day voting. If you are unfortunately in a state where you can only vote on election day, then you got to do all you can to make sure people go and vote on that day. But in Michigan, we've got a much better system now. All right. So we're going to turn to some Michigan specific information. For those of you that are not in Michigan, you can still put your questions in the chat about it. And then at the end, when Madison and I talk about all the things, I'll still share some useful information there. So August 6th is primary day in Michigan. That's a really critical day for a lot of elections. And depending on where you're at, that might be really the election that determines who gets ultimately elected to office. I'll give you an example. In Washtenaw County is a very fairly very blue county. So typically whoever wins the primary, especially in my district, is the person that's likely going to go on and win. And in some places, they don't even have a opponent to face in November. And then we get to November, the general election, and this year happens to be a presidential election. So it's going to be a big election year. And then I mentioned a few minutes ago that across Michigan, today is election day for some communities in Michigan for either renewal of certain millages, typically school millages. And then today would also be the day that if there are recall elections, and there is a recall election in the city of Ypsilanti. But there are some other parts of the state too. Okay. All right, another question. Got to keep you engaged with these questions. So, true or false? To vote absentee in Michigan, you need to have an approved reason. Don't see the poll, put your answer in the chat. Thank you, Madison. All right. Give it a little bit more time here. All right. Yep, summer is correct. This used to be true, but it's not true anymore. But it's a tricky one. So let's talk about why that's true, or why it's not true. Oh, you missed the poll. That's okay. Go ahead and they'll say your answer. Now you know the answer. All right. So in 2018, we expanded voting rights in Michigan. Many of you hopefully will remember this. And these are 3 of the really big things that came out of it. So we now have automatic voter registration through the Secretary of State's office if you're going to get your driver's license renewed, or if you're going to, I'm sorry for our non-Michigan friends in here. And next time I'll make sure I have some non-Michigan focused questions too. So now if you go to get your driver's license renewed, or you need to make some sort of update or change your address at Secretary of State's office, that automatically registers you to vote. You basically have to opt out of it, updating your voter registration or registering you to vote, which wasn't the way that it used to be before. The way it used to be before is you would go and then they would ask you, oh, you're updating your driver's license. Would you like to be registered to vote or update your voter registration? Now it just happens automatically, and you have to say, no, I would not like to be registered to vote. Please don't do that, which you shouldn't do that. We also have same-day voter registration now, including all the way up until election day. So if you, let's say you just moved to Michigan and you weren't registered to vote, and you moved here a week before the election, you can still register to vote. That's not the case in a lot of other states. So there are a lot of states where you might have to be registered to vote up to a month before the election. I mean, the date can differ depending on where you're at. And a lot of that has to do with trying to keep people from voting. So we've had some pretty significant, I'd say positive changes here in Michigan to make it easier for people to vote. And then the question that you all just answered, we now have no reason absentee voting. That used to not be the case. You used to have there used to be a list of reasons that you would have to identify, pick, oh, I'm not going to be here, so I need to do absentee voting. But now you can just vote absentee just for any reason. Yep, Kathleen, that's a good point. So Kathleen says in New Jersey, once you vote absentee, you automatically get an absentee ballot forever, all caps, for every election. No reason is necessary. We have that now too, or at least the option to opt into that. So in 2022, hopefully many of you remember Proposal 2, which passed and added a lot of additional voting rights to Michigan's Constitution. And one of them is, like Kathleen just mentioned, this permanent absentee ballot mailing list. So before, if you wanted to vote absentee, you would have to request an absentee ballot every time. Now you can just get it. I mean, you could say, I want to vote absentee forever, and you'll just be on the list, and then they will automatically send you the absentee ballot and with prepaid postage. So that's nice. You don't have to, even if you need the application will come with prepaid postage too. We also have ballot tracking information now. So it's like if you order something on Amazon and you're waiting to see when it's going to get delivered, you can follow along. Same thing with your ballot as it goes through the track. You've got tracking information for your ballot. Yeah, you'll be fine. You'll be fine with your CEU eligibility. And then 9 days of early in-person voting. So in addition to being able to vote absentee, now we have 9 days. You have to have at least 9 days of early. Most places are going to do 9, but many places might choose to do more than 9, where you can go into a place in person and vote, which is will be a game changer because it's not really like election day is election day anymore in Michigan. It's like election week and a half. And then more secure absentee ballot drop boxes. So if you're in Michigan, you may have seen these. They all look pretty much the same, where it says you can put your absentee ballots in this big old box. It looks like a mailbox, but I think it's like purple or reddish, and it's nice and it's secure. Good. Another question here. True or false? 16 to 17-year-olds can pre-register to vote in Michigan. Well, this was most significant different poll here. I think it's the last poll question. Now by 50-50. I'm in the chat. In Utah, everyone votes by mail. Unfortunately, our legislature would like to take away this, and that's a shame. Well, Kathleen, it's 50-50 chance. You can just, either one. You're not being graded on the questions, everybody. You just got to do them. I have to make them. You have to do them. It's okay if you don't get it right. I try to have a good time. Thank you. All right. Great. So the answer is true. It used to be false, but it is true now. So in 2023, we had even more changes to voting rights, and 16 and 17-year-olds being able to pre-register to vote is one of those changes. So prior to this, they could not, and now they can, which is really cool. And Michigan, for a while, had been the only state that prevented people from being able to provide transportation to people to the polls. So you wouldn't be able to hire somebody to take somebody else to the polls. Like, so for a nonprofit that wanted to go back to the nonprofits as an example, to go back to them wanting to help people get out to vote, they would not have been able to say, like, buy a Uber for somebody to take them to the polls. That would have been illegal, and that would have been unfortunate. And for a while, we were the only state that was doing that, which was particularly unfortunate because there was a period of time where Uber and Lyft were trying to do a lot of take people to election or to vote for low to no cost. And across the country, there were a lot of nonprofits or other organizations that were buying rides for people to be able to go and vote. But that just was not possible in Michigan. And since Michigan was the only state where that was illegal, that was very confusing for people because you just didn't know. Like, it was legal everywhere else in the country. why not here? Yep. And yeah, I'm glad that's history too. Yes, Charlotte, these demonstrate how important state elections are, but it's really important how, I mean, county elections are even more important, some might say. And that goes over all the changes in voting rights. So now I want Madison to come back on so we can talk about all those questions that I didn't answer earlier, and then answer any other questions that come up.
Justin, thank you. So there is concern that people choose not to vote because they lack understanding of the candidates, they don't know what issues are being voted on, and they are being fed misinformation on social media, news media, and other outlets. What are some ways to aid in voter education beyond passing out nonpartisan pamphlets?
Well, that's a good one. I mean, misinformation and disinformation is going to continue to be, I think, even more of a challenge for us to deal with. And it is something that deters people from voting, and it's done so on purpose. I mean, there's a lot of research that's been done now that in the last presidential election and the one before that, there was outside influence by other countries, largely Russia, targeting Black communities to try to get them to not vote. So the misinformation piece is significant. So I would say that the lean on resources that are reputable, like the League of Women Voters, and other actual news sources like MLive, which is actual news, and not blogs, for example, that post misinformation. I know a lot of people are relying on social media as their primary source of news media. That's not necessarily a good practice. And I know it's really challenging. I mean, for some people, they're on social media so much, and that's where they get the majority of all of their information. I would say use that as your launching pad to then start moving into more reputable information sources. I forget if this is publicly available or not, but on the U of M library website, we do have a toolkit, and we could probably dig this up, that talks about how to spot reputable news agencies or news sources versus ones that are not. What was the other part of the question?
Thinking about how people they lack understanding of candidates and they lack understanding of the issues being voted on. What are some ways to mobilize voters so that they do know what's on the ballot and what's being voted on each election?
Yeah, so the other piece around voter education and also educating yourself on things that are on the ballot. You can always see what's on the ballot well before the election. Like if you go in to vote and you haven't thought about what you're going to be voting for, then you're probably not going to know what's on there, and you're not going to know what to do. I say that people tend to be most familiar, like at the federal level, and then you go on down and people become less and less familiar. But there's a lot of really important things on the ballot that people aren't typically thinking about. The judges, for example, people tend not to know who judges are, and judges are elected officials. And they also get a little designation in Michigan on the ballot saying that they're the incumbent, which largely keeps people just voting for the judge that's already in there. Could be a terrible judge, you just don't know. Could be a really good judge. But so you need to do the homework before you go in, and that's one of the nice things about voting absentee is you can have the ballot at home with you, so you can spend some time looking up everybody. I would say that if you are looking at your ballot and there's a candidate who you can't find anything about on the internet, like they don't even have their own website, probably that's a red flag. So I'd say that it's all about preparation. The same thing is true for and if you're a Washtenaw County voter, there will be a number of millages on both of your ballots, the August and the November ballot, that everybody should do some education. Millages are local taxes, renewals of local taxes, what's going to be on your ballot. You got to do homework on that ahead of time. There's really no, you should not go in unprepared to vote. It's like going to take a test and you didn't study.
Oftentimes, a lot of the language that's used on ballots, particularly with proposals or millages, is often written like legalese. Can you point out some resources where people could find information on issues that are on the ballots, and how to know that those resources are nonpartisan and reputable, and explaining those issues in easy to understand terms?
Yeah, I would say, and knowing that we have a not just Michigan audience here, that the League of Women Voters is going to be the best resource for that, because they're going to have information both for candidates and for issues that are on the ballot to vote on, and they will present the information in a nonpartisan way. That would be, I'd say, like the fairest thing to say for anybody that's watching this, and if you're not in Michigan, the Legal Women Voters is going to be a good nationwide resource.
On that topic, there's a question in the chat asking if you can touch on the recent trend of groups like Moms for Liberty that are running for local elections like school and library boards, and the best ways that we can challenge those candidates.
Yeah, and it's a challenging one too, because they're often very well funded. We've been seeing significant increases in the amount of inside an area and outside an area funding for school board elections, which most school board positions are not paid. So when you're hearing like $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 being poured into a school board race, that's significant. But it's all the more reason why it's something that's really important. So I'd say that this is one of those things where I talk about the things that affect you on a day-to-day basis tend not to be the ones that the things that the federal government's working on. It's things that local school boards or city council or county commission is focused on. So I'd say that making sure that you have people, that you have candidates on the ballot. I mean, you'd be surprised at how many, depending on the community, that you might have a person of either party not even on the ballot, like, and voters don't even have a choice. So making sure that, one, you have candidates that are running that represent the values of the community and are going to be doing, the good. If it's school board, for example, we're talking about that, not wanting to burn books, for example, making sure we have the non-book burning candidates on the ballot, and then also supporting those people. I mean, you need to to win any election, you got to knock a lot of doors and talk to voters, and you also need money so you can do voter engagement, like mail and targeted social media and so on. So it's both things. Like, you have to get behind and volunteer and put in the time, but you also need to be able to make sure that there's the financial resources available for candidates.
So generally speaking, people are beginning to express that they won't vote for a certain candidate because they don't like one issue that the candidate stands for, despite the other things the candidate has accomplished. This is being seen a lot more across younger generations, which are increasingly expressing that they don't like any of the candidates, so they don't feel like voting. How can these issues be addressed to fight those notions and encourage voter participation?
Good question. I mean, this comes up a lot. It comes up in class a lot too. When I have conversations with students, I say, like, there is not going to be a candidate that 100% aligns with your values unless that candidate is you. So if that's how you feel, you should probably strongly consider running for office. Outside of that, the thing to keep in mind is, whether you're thinking about presidential candidates or anybody else, you're not trying to pick a person that you think is, you're trying to spend the rest of your life with that person, for example. You're not trying to pick that. There's going to have to be some overlap in the values or the goals that you want to see from that person, but you shouldn't expect it to be a 100% alignment. The only way you're going to get 100% alignment is yourself. So I'd say, of course, think about what issues are most important to you. But very rarely, like, there's always conversation about the single issue voter. Nobody really only cares about one issue. And maybe this person did something that you really didn't like on one thing, but you got to look at the totality of what any candidate or elected official has done or said that they're going to do, or what their values dictate that they would likely do, not just on a single issue. Because if you let that happen, that then will likely lead to people not engaging at all, and then they're not even having a role in the whole representative democracy thing that we're trying to do here. Right? Like, the only reason we have a representative democracy because we've decided that the way we want to govern ourselves is to pick other people to go make the policy decisions. They're not going to pick the thing that you want every single time unless it's you.
On that same topic, are there resources where people can find a candidate's voting history, whether in local elections, national elections, on any issues?
Yeah, if you are looking at federal stuff, federal and state largely, Ballotpedia is a good website, and they do cover some information for local candidates. Not often though. Sometimes you have to put the additional effort into going onto the website for whatever government is and looking and seeing how a person voted. So, for example, anytime that I have to vote for something, it shows up when we pass resolutions at the county level, and you can go and look at it and you can see how people voted. So in the absence of having a tool on Ballotpedia or any of those other kinds of websites, like they're not going to be there for city council people, for example, either, or school board people. You're going to have to go through and look at the meeting minutes or what resolutions or whatever got passed and manually look for yourself to see how they voted on an issue.
There was a comment in the chat earlier from Merrill, and they said one way to gain credibility in fighting misinformation regarding ballot procedures is to become a poll worker or an absentee ballot counter. But then prior to that, there was a question regarding concerns of being a poll worker because of intimidation tactics that have been used in the past. Are there ways that you can encourage people to engage with their local elections, be poll workers, while fighting that fear of intimidation?
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, it's a really valid question. And there was a lot of fear around voter or intimidation, not just of voters, but intimidation of election workers in the 2022 election cycle. And it just did not end up materializing in the same kind of way. So I would say that we need people to be poll workers, to be able to run the elections. You get paid to do it generally. So that's always a great opportunity to, you're not just like giving up the day and not getting anything for it. But the more people that are there, I think the less likely there are going to be opportunities for intimidation. And there are organizations that are paying attention to that kind of thing. Like the ACLU is always on top of, are there attempts at intimidating voters or poll workers? And they will have a rapid response. The political parties are paying attention to that. A number of organizations are, so it's really easily reportable. There's a comment in the chat that there was security provided at the polls in Ann Arbor. So I would say if we let the people that are trying to intimidate us out of having representative democracy win, then that's how we slide right into autocracy and fascism.
There's another question in the chat that I think you can answer perfectly. Can you talk about social workers running for office?
Yeah, I can talk about that all day. Anything specific? I'm doing it right now. I think, yeah, I'd say that, you know, one of the main reasons why I decided to run for office was because of the work that I did working at Community Mental Health and seeing the impact policy had on the clients that I was serving and how we needed people that had more of a focus on social justice and equity and making sure that we're really working to deliver on the things that are really important to people. I think it's really critical that we do get more social workers running for office because it's a perspective that is very useful. I think especially in local and county level government because it's so service provision focused. It's one of the things that even if you didn't graduate from a program where there was specific training around politics or policy engagement, largely social workers are in a good spot to do that because of the wide range of training we get around community organizing and advocacy and program evaluation and interpersonal practice. I mean, there's not another field that trains you across the spectrum of services in that same way, which I think really equips social workers uniquely well to run for office. There's also research on it that shows that most social workers that end up running for office end up finding that they were prepared to be effective at it, largely because the interpersonal skills are the ones that get used the most, particularly after you win. I think oftentimes there's a difference between the skills that it takes to be effective at campaigning and the skills that it takes to be effective at governing. And social workers tend to have pretty good, I think, transferable skills to governing. And maybe some more like the campaigning stuff is what needs to be worked on. What else we got?
Thank you so much, Justin. I will put a final call out for questions. If anybody has them, please put them in the chat. Do you have recommendations of where a social worker interested in running for office can start? If we have no idea how to even get started with that journey, where can we begin to look? Where can we look to learn and begin?
Yeah, well, we have an online certificate in political social work here at U of M. That's somebody want to throw that in the chat. That's a great way to get started in learning a wide variety of skills, not just about running for office, but being more politically engaged. I'd say that the Voting and Social Work group that I mentioned earlier, they also do different candidate trainings throughout the year that are social work focused. They do a 2-day training, so that's also a good one. That's at the Nancy Humphreys Institute at UConn. And sometimes they do that around the the country to. We partnered with them and did one in Michigan right before the pandemic. And yeah, it was like a week before the pandemic started. So I'd say both of those, the certificate program we have here at, for continuing ed. So I mean, many of you are taking this for continuing ed. So if you need more continuing ed credits, that's a great way to get that too. There's another question. You know, places of worship open to hosting get out the vote meetings. I mean, some places of worship do that. It just depends on the place. They frequently will host candidate forums too. So I'll put the link in the chat for the certificate program. Any other questions from anybody? Everybody's going to go and do voter registration, do some good voter education work there.
Well, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat.
Okay.
So Justin, thank you so much for presenting today. And thank you to everyone for attending the second session of this year's Building Healthy Strong Communities Conference. We hope to see you at another session over the next couple of days. The final session of the day, titled Centering Social Justice and Non-Public Behavioral Healthcare Part 1, Foundations of Centering Social Justice, will begin at 3 p.m. Eastern today. In the next 1 to 2 weeks, those who have met the attendance requirements will receive an email from our continuing education office. Any questions regarding CE should be directed to ssw.conted@umich.edu, and that email is on the screen right now. Thank you and have a wonderful day.